And so again, we've worked with all the top the sports organizations to the special forces, training people at the very top. And this has given us a very unique perspective to look at not only from a clinical standpoint, but also from a performance standpoint. And it's interesting because most people don't know that Red Bull sponsors more athletes than even Nike. Okay, so they sponsor a tremendous amount of athletes. Now, the problem is that Red Bull's athletes are always getting hurt because these are guys that basically think that hey, I should try and do a triple flip on a motorcycle, in front of everybody, or jump off the Grand Canyon without a parachute and a little squirrel suit and see if I can fly down. And and it's interesting. These guys, even on like the motorcycle stuff, they will try this stunt over and over and over a foam pit and not be successful. Never land it once. And then they come up with the idea, I ought to do this at the X Games at the Staples Center in front of all these people, and I'm sure I can pull it off there. Okay, and so obviously there's a lot of concussions involved with that. There's a lot of really prefrontal damage when someone's making those decisions over and over. And Red Bull is very clear for us not to fix that because they wouldn't have any athletes doing these stunts if they had good executive function. And so we just basically get their brain back to where it was. Not healthy, but back to where it was. And when we talk about performance, we really are talking about there's so many clinical things inside of performance. We've trained a guy named Felix Baumgartner, who maybe many of you guys have probably recognized him. He had the highest free fall jump on record. Okay, and so this is a guy that went, this balloon took him up, to the edge of space, about 1,000 feet higher. He would just start floating up. Okay, and he's going to do a free fall jump with a parachute. Has to go through the sound barrier and everything and land. Now, most people think we trained him for reaction speed or coordination or all these things, the stress of dealing with this. But actually, we didn't train him for any of that. We trained him for claustrophobia. Okay? Because this is a guy that typically jumps off mountains and stuff without a shirt on. He jumps, he feels the air, he's making corrections with his hands as he's going down, he's feeling everything. And when we had him at the Red Bull Center, and he had to put this spacesuit on, these are 20-pound gloves covering up your hands, a big helmet and this 100-pound spacesuit on. And he started to put it on, and he started to have a panic attack. And he runs out of the room. Everybody thought, well, we'll just give him a little bit of a break. And long story short, it was within a few hours we started looking for him and stuff. And 2 days later, he called from Austria. He went back home. He flew back home. Said he has spent 24 hours in the hospital for a panic attack. He's never had anything like this. He said the project is off. Now Red Bull has $10 to $15 million into the project at this point. And so he said it's off, and they actually delayed the whole program for over a year. And Felix was back in Santa Monica about a year later, doing another little smaller jump for Red Bull. And Andy Walsh, the head of Red Bull High Performance, said, hey, I want you to come over and meet Brian Hickson, some stuff they're doing with these EEG tracking that we put up. We have systems inside the Red Bull High Performance Center in Santa Monica. And so he came over, and we said, hey, we just want to hook up a sensor right here to your forehead and just kind of track your stress. And with that, he's doing it. He's doing pretty good. And then Andy said, hey, Felix, I want you to start thinking about that spacesuit. Start thinking about what happened. And all those anxiety waves, you could see it on the EEG, start shooting right up. Okay. And then we had him do some breathing techniques and stuff like that, and he could start to bring it back down. He would think about it more. It would go up, and it'd come back down. After a while, about 30 minutes, we could keep him down. Okay, his actual brainwave activity, those high beta waves that shoot up during anxiety, could stay nice and down as he thought about it. So then Andy Walsh pulls out the spacesuit out of a closet and pulls it across the room. Straight up. And it's going straight up. It took us about 3 hours now to be able to have him control it and bring it down and get it to the right place. And long story short, after about another hour that day and about 3 hours the next day, we had him in the full spacesuit. Okay. Now the reason being is because claustrophobia is a lot like any other anxiety disorder. Okay. An anxiety disorder is a lack of control. Okay. When you don't have control, you're actually fearing the fear of being out of control. right? And when you give someone a sensor and they can see their brain activity, they start to become in control. They can start to bring that down before they feel that anxiety lifting. They can start to see the brain activity coming down, and they reinforce that, and they keep going, and they keep these breathing techniques and doing things, and it's settling down their whole system. And they become in control, and you're really giving them parasympathetic control versus staying in a sympathetic state all the time, which is super important. And like I said, even when he put on the suit and bring this on, he kept this on, and he could see it start to go up. And when it would start to go up is when he would correct it. Anytime you have that little bit of stress coming on, the people that can handle stress, the people that handle speaking in front of thousands of people, when they start to get nervous, they feel it really early on, and they can self-correct. They can course correct that back down. The people that get up in front of crowds and their hands are sweating and they're starting to sweat and they're all this stuff, at that point you're having this physiological reaction that it's hard to come back from. It's very difficult to course correct. So we gave him the ability to see these minute changes in his brain way before he even felt it, and he could correct it back down. And like I said, the project was back on, and we know that he went all the way up 5 hours in that thing and jumped out and landed safely. So again, the difference between clinical and performance, so many of these athletes, it's all about clinical things. It's about anxiety problems. It's about insomnia. It's about, we train, again, all these NBA athletes, and it's time changes and adapting to sleep schedules and things are just constant, okay? So we have that same equipment, again, locally, which is nice, here at the Oaks Christian Brain Performance Center. The reason this is in existence is I got to give my wife some credit here, because she is a Pilates instructor in Westlake, and she would always be telling her clients what her husband does and how we can change the brain and how he works with all these people and helps all these things, and they would say, well, gosh, my kid has attention deficit, I have anxiety, insomnia, or someone has early onset dementia, any of these type of things, and they would say, well, how can we do this? How do we participate in this? And her answer always was, unless you're Kobe Bryant, you don't have access to this. Unless you're this star or that person or special forces, you don't have access to this same high-end technology. And so she always told me basically that I was doing no good for anybody. And I was taking rich athletes and making them a little bit better, and were people that really didn't need it, and the people that really needed this were going underserved on this. So she kept harassing me for a long time till finally we agreed to open something locally on here. So that's where the school approached me and said, hey, we'll put in the money to make this center right and do just the same type of technology we use at these high performance centers, and it worked out great. We don't advertise it much because I really don't have much time to manage the thing, but the school handles all the business side. I'm just the director. I show up, I go over the brain maps with people, and we kind of keep it a small, kind of the best secret probably in the whole Thousand Oaks area. So, but it's a great center, has amazing, and it's so great too because the kids, especially after concussions, we're able to get baselines on these. That whole EEG baseline, someone has a concussion, we can restore it right back to where it was. We can see it's not these impact tests and all these things, which are great little pieces of the puzzle, but when it becomes the entire puzzle, people can fake it. People can, it just is not as accurate or sensitive as physiology. And that's the most important thing, and that's what we're going to get to here, is that physiology is what really matters. And I think, and I'm sorry if there's any psychiatrists in the room here, but the psychiatry is the only medical specialty that doesn't link a diagnosis to physiology. Okay? And we've got to correct that. All this mental stuff and what everybody's dealing with these are really symptoms. Attention deficit disorder is a symptom. There is 10 different physiology components that can cause attention deficit disorder, right? Pain is a symptom, right? Chronic pain, all these things, and it's exactly how it is with the mental side. And really, to understand the brain, you have to understand, first of all, that everything is electric. Everything is electrochemical reactions shooting across here. When I move my finger like this, there is an electrochemical reaction. It's producing more electricity right in this spot going up higher, and when I stop, it goes back down. When I'm focusing, there's a portion right in the prefrontal portion of my brain that is actually producing more electricity, and when I stop focusing, it goes back down. Now, the electricity that can go across here is limited to the amount of connections, the amount of neurons that are connected, those dendrites, that can hold. So think of it as the size of the wiring. Okay? The wiring of the brain predicts how much electricity can go. So when we're measuring EEG, we are measuring in a lot of ways how much connections, especially if we put it under load, how much connections you have in that area. And that's why EEG is so stable, is because it depends on the amount of connections, and those connections don't undo and connect constantly. There's pruning that happens in a slow process. There's more connections that happen in a slow process too. So it's very stable from day to day. And that's why it's such a great measurement of brain activity. And so the other thing to keep in mind is that each part of the brain does a specific function. Okay, so this is straight out of medical textbook. We know each part of the brain that does this. Now, obviously, on anything we do, covers multiple areas. There's not like one function we're using just one portion of the brain. It's like a muscle. We use all kinds of different areas through there. But we know that, say, this sensory motor strip right here controls our fine motor movement. So that's why I said when I move this finger, it's the opposite side of the brain, actually activates that. So if someone has a problem where they're not producing enough electricity in the sensory motor area of the brain, that sensory motor strip, they will have fine motor issues. And for kids, that can be handwriting problems. For later on seniors and stuff, that can be start to having problems all the way to, things like Parkinson's and stuff. It's a decay of those neurons in that area, and it starts to break down. All the way to the prefrontal area of the brain is very involved in attention, organization, and planning. Okay, and really this kind of reward and evaluation too, and a lot of different things. If someone is not producing enough electricity in that area of the brain, they can't do those things, or they can start to, but then it fades out because electricity actually comes down. And that's because there's not enough connections in those areas, okay? It's like having a weak muscle. The other problem that can happen is that this part of the brain can become over-connected, okay, which is really where it's producing too much electricity consistently. And again, one of my other jobs I do is I run a lot of the brain performance programs and the EEG programs for the U.S. Army. My business partner, like I said, is a medical director for the U.S. Army, so we do a lot with post-traumatic stress disorder. We work with Walter Reed and a lot of different organizations within that. So what happens is each area of electricity should be able to maximize, come up in electricity, and then it goes back down. Okay, so if I move this finger really fast, it goes up, and as I slow down and move it down, it comes back down. As I'm concentrating really hard, it goes up, and as I stop, it slowly goes back down. Think of every area of the brain almost like gears in a car. Should go from first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear, fifth, all the way up, and then come back down. Well, with post-traumatic stress disorder, areas of the brain get stuck because you're only using certain gears. So if you're in, let's say, Iraq, these guys that, come back here, they're having to go, some of these guys, some of the ones we've trained, they're going door to door into these different houses, okay? And there could be 100 houses. And they are knocking on the door, knowing that one out of these 100 could be someone that's going to blow them up or kill them, and the other 99 is going to be the sweetest little woman with a bunch of little kids. Okay? And imagine the state you're in, where you have to try and stay in this calm state. You can't just go barreling in, but knowing that you have to be in this hypervigilant state, too, of something that could happen. And it's like that all the time. Every time they're driving on a road, there could be something go off. And when they're sleeping at night, things go off. So there's all kinds. So you become in this hypervigilant state, and a lot of times your sensory integration area right back here of the brain, which is the parietal area of the brain, becomes so heightened all the time that it never goes back down. And when you stay there for so long, the brain re-regulates, and it stays basically in fourth gear, becomes rest, fifth gear becomes active, and it just stays right there, and it doesn't go back down. And that will cause all kinds of issues, especially in that sensory integration area. It can cause all kinds of chronic pain. This is where nerve sensations are all processed, muscular feelings are all processed, all kinds of touch sensation. Everything is coming through that sensory integration area, and then it causes a huge hypervigilant reaction to things, to sounds and sensory processing as well. And so what we have to do with neurofeedback is we can place a sensor, an EEG sensor, right on that spot. So after we map them and we find those areas, we can place a sensor right on that spot, and we can actually make it to where we put it through a biofeedback response or a video game that will only go forward when that electricity directly underneath that sensor comes down. And when that electricity goes back up, the game comes to a stop. And when it goes back down, it goes forward. So it's this constant thing. At first, we just mirror their activity. Even though they're stuck way up here, they're constantly going like this. The brain's not static. It's moving electricity. So we're just mirroring their existing electricity. And then once they get better at it, and we can see every time the brain goes down, we can see a little line that pops down. And it first of all does it by accident. Every few seconds, you'll see that little line go. And then it starts to get a little bit faster, because every time that game goes forward, the brain says, what did I just do? What just made that go forward? And it is only 10 milliseconds now with the technology we have. 10 milliseconds. By the time the electricity changes, by the time the feedback is updated. Okay, that's extremely fast. It's very subconscious state. It takes almost 300 milliseconds to become consciously aware of that. So you are actually picking up on that subconsciously ahead of time. And when we reward that and it goes down, then after you get pretty good and it's going quite a bit, every few times per second, then we make it a little bit harder. Now it's got to come down a little further to be able to go down, and move forward. And then we add 10% more and 10% more, and we can re-regulate that brain activity. It's literally no different than I could take a stethoscope on my heart, run it through a computer, try some different breathing exercises, and I could learn to lower my heart rate when I want to, and I could learn to raise my heart rate. And all I need is the biological response or feedback response from that. Okay? So we do the same thing with the brain. And so each of these areas need to produce enough electricity. If this prefrontal area produces too much electricity and is constantly stuck in that area, then you get things like obsessiveness, compulsiveness, okay, OCD type symptoms, perfectionism. You can't let go. And right underneath this cortex area, there's the cingulate of the brain, the portion right underneath that is called the anterior cingulate, and that is the portion of the brain that really is kind of our gear shifter. It allows us to let go of one thing and shift to something else and not become really compulsive. And I want to give one example because we're training a lot, it seems like lately, of addictions, and especially in alcoholics, that area of the brain, the anterior cingulate, becomes very hypervigilant. It's constantly on. It's like having a spasm in a muscle. Okay, it's constantly, and when I say constantly on, these are just neurons constantly firing. Okay, and when a neuron fires, it requires nutrients, oxygen, blood flow to that area, and that's why when people are under stress, they have more, their heartbeat actually is faster because they're under stress. They actually have to supply more blood flow to the brain. The brain takes up the majority of the blood flow. And so when those neurons are firing in the anterior cingulate, when you drink alcohol, it has a sedative response, and it actually hits that and actually lowers that activity, okay, which becomes more to a homeostasis type state. Now, when it does that, the brain likes that so much, it doesn't even know what you just did. It says, whatever that behavior you just did, I want, because that just brought this down. I stopped having to work so hard. And so it dumps a bunch of dopamine in your system when it does that, to reward you for doing that. Okay? When you drink, you are not addicted in any way to the response you get from the alcohol. You become addicted to the dopamine that gets released because of the homeostasis that just happened in the brain. And it wants that because it stops working. Okay? And so the dopamine response is so strong of a reward to the brain that consequences are down here and reward is up here. And that's when addiction becomes a problem, is when the reward and consequences become so far skewed that now you will always choose this and never even think about this. Okay? You become very impulsive to this. You don't think at all. The brain craves this. And the brain, it wants that so bad that every single time you do that action, again, it dumps that dopamine, so it's reinforcing that action or that behavior. So what we can do is when we place a sensor on that area and bring down that activity, then it normalizes that activity. So now you're already low with that. So next time you go to drink, you're not getting the dopamine response because it's already low. It's not changing homeostasis at all, and so it's not producing dopamine. So what happens is almost every person that's battling with addiction, especially alcohol addiction, that comes to us always says, well, what behavior do I need to change? And we always tell them, hey, we're not psychologists. We're gonna work on the physiology of the brain. We're not asking you to change any behavior at all. You continue exactly what you do. All we're going to do is even out the reward and consequence. And the reward and consequence, when it's equal, will start changing behavior. Because consequences change behavior. It's the best way to change behavior. But when there's no consequence and huge reward, you don't change behavior. So once we start working this and even this out, I just had a guy come all the way from Utah, flew in and went through this whole thing in 30 days. He's tried all these different programs. He said he couldn't even barely verbalize how the feeling he said he had when he went to drink. He said, it's the very first time I thought about it. I had this few seconds of thinking about what I was doing and how this would affect things. And he said that changed everything. Because he said before I didn't ever think about it. There was no prefrontal action. It was impulsive. My brain was striving to get that dopamine. And now he started to think about it. He said, I still drank when I did that. But then I had a consequence from that. And the next time I went to do it, I started to think more, and I remembered that consequence more. He said the second time, I stopped drinking. And the third time, I can change that behavior completely. So you can take someone that has an addiction, and instead of eliminating this trigger out of their entire life and taking all their friends out and doing anything. I'm not saying, that there's not a lot of therapy that needs to be done with a lot of these people. They learn behaviors, they have to undo behaviors. But once you undo the physiology in the brain that is reinforcing the behavior, now you can work with a therapist. Now you can work with a coach. Now you can learn strategies to undo those things and be successful. When you don't have the capacity to do that, when you have a part of your brain that is reinforcing that behavior and you're working against the neurotransmitters in your brain, there is no amount of therapy except for complete abstinence and completely removing yourself that's going to work with that. And so what we can do again and really focus on is removing the physiology and allowing the brain now to have equal consequence. Just a quick story on this. I've got a guy that, if I had time I'd show the video, but it's an amazing video because it's this 65-year-old guy comes in and he's drugged in by his family, and he's a smoker, and he smoked for 40 years. He's a Caltrans worker. He goes through 2 packs of cigarettes a day. He said there's no way he's quitting. He's tried quitting 4 times before. There's no way it's going to work. His family wants him to quit, and so I told him, don't quit. Just continue to do exactly what you're doing. Let's just train this part of the brain, just see what happens. He agreed to that. And so then he does this video for us at the end of his testimony. He said, after about 3 weeks of this therapy here where you're training my brain, he said, I walked out the door of my normal, I grabbed my 2 packs of cigarettes, walked out, got on my tractor, pulled out the cigarette, put it in my mouth. He said about noon, I realized that I never lit the cigarette. It was just stuck in my mouth. Okay? And he goes on, he says, after about another week, I walked out my door, grabbed my 2 packs of cigarettes, walked out, got on my tractor, and he said it was about noon at that time when he realized his cigarettes were still in his pocket. He never pulled them out. Long story short, he goes on to the very end, and he talks about after about 6 weeks, he walked out the door, he gets on his tractor, it's nighttime, and he's starting to go back home, and he starts to pack his cigarettes, and he realized he left them at home and didn't even grab them that day. Okay? This is where when the brain becomes normalized, it's just about breaking habit. And his habit had to be broken just because he's for 40 years never walked out the door and forgot his cigarettes. That's top of mind. When there's dopamine release, when there's all these addictions, that's the number one thing. But now, pure laziness allowed him to walk out the door without it, right? It didn't need it, so he wasn't after it. And that's, how we want to address these type of things all the way from the brain. So again, we do an EEG brain map. which can really show us, all-night tinnitus. It's the same clinical grade EEG that you would do for a sleep study or seizure disorder or epilepsy, anything like that. And then we get these maps that come back, and they're compared to the same age and gender, large normative database, and we're looking at electrical activity. Now, our normative ranges are all the way from 1.5 standard deviations low to about 1.5 standard deviations high. That's about 96% of a population. So we are not trying to make everybody's brains the same. We want you to be within 96% of women your age or males your age. Okay, and the reason we do separate by gender is because we all know that women are so much smarter than men, and so we want to make sure it's fair. Now, the reason we do male and female is because, and no one even went for that, huh? Exactly. The reason we do male and female is because males' brains are a little bit thicker. The skull's a little bit, not the brain, the skull is thicker. I know. You laugh every time, but it is true. We do have thicker skulls, and so it does diffuse the power as it goes through the skull. So it looks like women are smarter, but if we drilled through the brain and measured on everybody, we'd all have the exact same. Okay? So sorry guys, it's not true. It looks like it. It does appear though, and we do have thicker skulls. So then what we do is we can break the electrical activity instead of looking at all the frequencies together, which you typically do if you're looking for seizure disorder or some type of thing like that, where you can see the predominant rhythm coming through. But now with the computers, we can break the frequencies apart by function in the brain. And there's over 1,000 peer-reviewed studies on this, so we know where each of these breaks are. Now there's a little bit of overlap between them, but the basic frequency bandwidths are delta waves, which are everything below about 4 hertz. Okay, so 2, a lot of people include 1 as well. We include 2 through 4 hertz. These control your full autonomic nervous system. Okay, these are what keep you alive. This is what controls your circadian rhythms at night, high amplitude that comes every 90-minute cycles that go through. This is what controls your immune function. This is what controls your digestion. It controls your circulation. All these type of things, completely subconscious. You have no control over that. Okay, so people that have problems with sleep cycles, we will usually see either 3 standard deviations low, where it's not producing enough electricity to control those sleep cycles, so you slip in and out of them, you can't get standardized sleep at all, the sleep cycles are all messed up. A lot of times shift workers and stuff will have that type of activity just from over time. Or if there's more hypervigilant states, where a lot of red, where there's producing too much power, a lot of times that's from a concussion injury, some type of injury to the brain, TBI injury, but it can also just be excessive amounts of neurons where the brain loses its ability to regulate. Again, the brain has to regulate. It needs to come up at times, it needs to go down at times, up and down. Remember that, shifting through gears. And when it doesn't, when it loses its ability to regulate and stays up high, it causes problems. So we see a lot of times with that absolute power on the slowest waves, those delta waves, when they're really high, people have very sensitive autonomic nervous systems, okay? Very sensitive systems. Think of it as reactions easily to any type of stressors, like gluten, right? Like type of lactose, all these, irritable bowel problems. It can be all kinds of things. It can be an autoimmune disease, or, things like lupus affect the delta waves. Most allergies have a component in the brainwaves. Now, there's a lot of other things that go into allergies, of course, and I don't want to make this look like this is the only thing, but there's a lot of things here to where we can correct those alpha waves, and allergies do either get better, or in some cases they will actually completely go away if it's all based in these deltas. It's just the regulation of it.
If you have like anger issues or different emotional imbalances, do you see that a lot?
You would see it in some of the higher waves on that. Yeah, these again are the totally subconscious waves, just the autonomic nervous system. So we can look there and see if there's problems in there. We can look at the theta waves. So theta waves, think of all these as an arousal curve in the brain. Okay, you can think of these as first gear through fifth gear, right? And the brain is shifting through these states at all times. Every one of these frequencies is always in the brain all the time. Okay, but it's like the old school graphic equalizers. Okay, when you turn the treble way up, treble goes way up, but the bass is still there, it's just real low. When you turn the bass way up, it goes way up, but the treble's still there, it just goes real low. So when I'm sleeping at night, delta waves go up, these kind of go down low and stuff. When I'm stressed and say I'm hiking and a mountain lion pops up, my high beta waves shoot way up, My delta waves and stuff, get out of the way, okay? Because you don't need good sleep cycles when you're being chased by a mountain lion, right? So so those are happening at all different times of the day. So again, let's go to alpha real quick. Alpha waves are when your brain is fully conscious. It's the first time the brain's fully conscious, but it's not engaged in an activity. So think of this like a car in neutral. Engine's fully going, but it's not moving forward. This is very much associated with being very present-minded, okay? Not thinking about your to-do list, not thinking about all the stuff you did in the past. This is being very present. That's why it's very much to do with meditation. Mindfulness meditation, you should be clearing all that and really just focusing on breathing and what it feels like and your breath and different specific things. Very focused. And if you have enough alpha waves, you also can be very focused with, that's where more empathy comes. If you're very present in a conversation with someone, you're not thinking about the past, you're not thinking about the future, you can connect with that person more, okay? You can also, alpha has a lot to do with the brakes of a busy mind. So think of it as if I'm in beta and I'm going, alpha allows me to stop that. So we train a lot of pro athletes. So a lot of these NBA guys, they'll be going down the court and an injustice will happen. Okay, that means that, the ref called a bad call, or the fight breaks out or something like that. The people with the low alpha can't let that go. There's no brakes to that. It just ruminates over and over and over and over. And it messes up their performance. We work with a lot of sports psychologists and stuff with the sporting programs and a lot of athletes. And, everybody wants to know what is the best flow state. Which one of these is the best flow state for performance? It's not about which one of these is the best. That's like saying which gear of the car is the best gear, right? It's about being able to shift. It's about that fluidity of being able to shift from state to state as needed. Okay, just like in a car, the best shifter usually is going to win, right? So we want to be able to shift into alpha when we want to put the brakes on things. Think of this as, this is, for athletes, this is the golfer that just pushed a 1-foot putt last hole. Does he carry that with him into the next hole and it changes everything? Or he went into the water last time on this hole. Does that change everything? Or does he let that go right back down to the 10,000 hours he's put in, the memory, the muscle memory and everything, and just be present and just let those neurons actually coordinate the muscle movement as it goes through? Okay? And so let's go back to theta. So theta is in between delta, completely subconscious, and conscious activity. Okay? So theta waves are that combination between conscious and subconscious. So think of that as like, obviously, daydreaming, right? Fatigue, getting tired, waking up in the morning. All these type of things can cause theta waves. Anytime the brain is tired, it causes theta waves. The FDA just gave an indication, diagnosis for attention deficit. If you have too many theta waves right above that prefrontal area there, it actually is indicated for attention deficit, because that is the type of wave it's a daydreaming wave, it's a slow wave, and you're asking someone to pay attention with those waves. That's very much like you driving home at night and getting tired and just staring at the road. If you stare at the road, you're going to go off the road. You're going to die, right? It's not, you don't just stare at the road. So what you do is you turn up your radio, you roll down your window, you move around, you create your own hyperactivity, and it stimulates your brain. And that's why you see a kid with ADHD, with this type of disorder, a slow wave disorder, that's fidgeting, that's moving around. They are actually stimulating their sensory motor strip, which is like a drip of stimulation right behind this attention network, and it's actually stimulating that. So it's actually putting a little bit of electricity through there. You tell a kid, don't move, don't do that, and I want you to focus. They can't do that because the brain's starving for stimulation. Okay? And if they did, they would literally fall asleep. So that's why you take a kid with high theta waves, or kind of sleepier waves, and they can't focus, they have all this brain fog. And you can't have them sit still unless you give them a stimulant, right? A stimulant, just like if you pulled over and got a coffee or a Red Bull, I had to give a plug in there for Red Bull, then you can stare at the road, right? Now the problem is, and this is why in the future, we just met with the FDA and stuff on this, and I think it's going to be probably 5 years out, but in the future, every single person should get a scan here before we prescribe medication. Because first of all, we can see, is this a slow disorder? Is this too much theta waves over that? We know what medication does to that. But typically, in the majority of cases, people don't have red over the whole thing or high theta over the entire brain. They've got a little spot, just like one of those little spots over there, a little spot in the prefrontal area, which means that that stimulant medication is going to help the 5% of the brain there, and it's going to hurt the 95% of the brain that was already good. Because you can't give stimulant medication to one area of the brain. It floods the entire brain. Any medication is going to go to the entire brain. So the more diffuse the activity is all the way across the brain, you're going to get a better response and lower side effects from that medication. And we know if it's slow wave, we know stimulant will actually bring that up, wake that part of the brain up. It'll be fine. If you give now the problem is with symptoms, you could have someone in high beta over here that has a little bit of anxiety waves over those, and they're doing the exact same thing. Actions look identical. They're moving around, they're fidgeting and stuff, and it's more towards anxiety. You give that person a stimulant medication, their high beta is going to go straight up, and they're going to have all kinds of anxiety attack, right? And then we have all kinds of times when you've got low activity here and high activity there. Okay? And we treat all kinds of people with that, and a lot of those people have more suicidal tendencies and issues because of the fact that anything you do to help this is going to hurt that. And any medication you do to that is going to hurt this. And so it starts causing all these problems. You can cause anxiety side. Most people that we see that are even younger kids cutting themselves, okay? Most people think that that is more towards an anxiety disorder. Well, it's not. It's most of the time towards low functioning, low activity, low beta waves. So if you have low sensory integration, low overall processing on things to where you're not feeling alive, you're not feeling anything, and you cut yourself, the endorphin rush you get from that, again accompanied by the dopamine that's responded as well, gives you a sense of, it's like taking a stimulant. It's like taking something, you feel something finally, and you feel better with it. That's why a lot of these people are cutting, is because they feel better. And what are we doing? Most of the time we're putting them on an SSRI or some type of sedative type medication for that, which makes it worse. It pushes it down even more. You can actually give someone like that stimulant, and it brings up the brain waves. Now when they cut themselves, all they feel is pain. Okay, again, we've evened out the consequence to the action. If you feel pain, you stop cutting yourself. Right? And so, so that's where it's so important to do these brain maps before medication is given. Now, and I'd also argue that medication is a great bridge strategy, a great short-term strategy, but long-term, the brain adapts to it, right? You give it, yes?
Yeah, I worked for many years with people that would cut themselves to relieve the pain. How does that work?
Well, then is what's happening is they're actually distracting themselves, right, from other pain. So they're actually getting a distraction, which takes their mind off the other pain. And if, especially a lot of times with the pain they're trying to distract themselves from is dull pain or some type of chronic pain, and stuff that is really, I hate saying brains or the pain's in the brain, because all pain is in the brain, but it's that chronic constant pain that by doing the other thing releases endorphins and it distracts them, and they can actually feel a little better. Now, a lot of times the problem is, though, that again when you scan someone like that, because we've had a number of people that are exactly what you're talking about, they have low beta waves. Now, low beta waves, beta is what controls everything in your brain. Okay, that's what controls all the processing. If you have low beta and you've had chronic pain for a while, maybe you had surgery or something, and then the brain's basically, they say, is memorize the pain, right? So the surgery healed, but you still have the same pain. It's because that this part of the brain is so low, it can't control the brain's response to that. It can't actually shut off the brain. It can't really regulate. It's not producing enough waves or enough electricity to regulate that brain, regulate the pain in the brain. So on that person, that's what we see a lot with chronic pain, especially in the sensory area here, where it's very low activity. So that person is distracting themselves, but they're also getting a dopamine rush from cutting themselves because it's low activity, and it's actually probably offsetting a lot of the pain too when you're getting that dopamine too. Yep.
These were people who had been horribly abused as kids. It's more
Right.
pain.
Exactly. So yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And those can be, again, where you get it could be heightened activity and stuff too. With those things, and that's where, I have done over 10,000 brain maps, which there's very few people in the country that have done 10,000 brain maps on this. And with those 10,000 brain maps, I still, based on every symptom you could give me, will be right about 50% of the time. Okay? And that's after looking at 10,000 brain maps. And that's why it's so important to map, because we can understand what is really. If I took each of those people that did the same thing, they probably had different brain activity that would probably be causing it. And that's where, based on symptoms, we can guess. But to prescribe a lot of times based on symptoms, you're guessing. And then you're having to, add more to this cocktail of all these things and stuff. So understanding this, and this is, that's what's great about EEG. It's 96% specific and sensitive, according to Walter Reed Medical. So it's hugely accurate. And EKG is about 78%. Okay, so we take that as a gold standard. So all these waves are really important. Now I want to get quickly, because Jim knows I'll get kind of lost in this EEG side. The biggest thing I want to talk about with that EEG is, again, we've been using neurofeedback. We use a lot of things, but we have been doing so much lately with just nutrition. Because a lot of these people have diffuse activity. When you've got a little, spot on the head that's, concussion activity, those neurons aren't connected or disconnected or sheared or something, nutrition, it can help heal it faster, it can help do things, but you can't really go right in and do things. It's very global. It's much like medication. But so many of these people have really nutritional deficits that are causing this problem. Omega-3s can help increase the neural connections, because it's a precursor to BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So the more omega-3s you have, the more BDNF you can actually produce, which actually causes more neurogenesis and grows more neurons here, more dendrites together. Okay, so we really want to look at the whole nutritional side here. And the last thing I want to talk about with this is with the brain mapping, we do a lot of, we're looking at the cortex, but you have this inside portion structure of the brain called the limbic system. And the limbic system is kind of like your animal instincts. Okay, that's what processes all of your fear, to your emotions, to your mood, all these things. And now what should happen is, I have fear, and my cortex, my brain says, nope, that's unrational. You don't need to even worry about that. I have a learned response. I've done this 3 times, and it's been successful every time. So it puts the brakes on that, okay? So the limbic system is like a newborn baby, has all limbic system. They haven't even formed really their full cortex yet. That's why, kids, when they're growing up, they say they have an immature brain. It's really the cortex, right? The brakes haven't fully formed. Now, for adults, when the limbic system becomes overactive and the cortex becomes underactive, it causes a lot of emotional issues, okay? I always tell people, this is like when the limbic system is out of control and you have low power on the cortex. That's like, a normal limbic system is like driving, a car 65 miles an hour down the freeway. 65 miles an hour down the freeway should not give you anxiety, right? That's normal. That's no problem at all. But if you didn't have any brakes, you would start to have anxiety going 65 miles an hour down the freeway, right? So it's the same thing. You can have your emotions going on, your mood and everything, and if this is low activity, low power, and it's not putting the brakes on it, then it can cause problems. And a lot of chronic pain activates the whole emotional side of the brain. The whole limbic system becomes overactive, produces lots of theta waves, and basically the brain loses its regulation of being able to turn that off. And it just is up all the time, and so it stops, and it's like leaving the spigot on. It's just constant flow of theta waves, and it covers the whole brain in that. And it's, I just had a guy yesterday, we dealt with that. He had an emotional breakdown and lost his job, lost a few family members and everything. I mean, you scan his brain, everything in the brain looks perfect except for theta is covered the whole thing. There's only one thing that can cause the theta waves to have that much theta, and that's this limbic system, which produces most of that. And if you think about it, the limbic system we talked about has all the subconscious and conscious together. Well, think about things like mood. Right? Mood is subconscious and conscious together. Emotions are subconscious and conscious together. Intuition, conscious and subconscious together. Fear, conscious and subconscious together. All those things. So the whole limbic system produces tons. It mixes completely together this conscious and subconscious. And when you have too much, then you can have even things like paranoia, hallucinations, and a lot of things can get even worse with it.